Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Five. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a remarkable trial, one where a young man made the entire legal system take a hard look at itself. This event took place at the Hennepin County Courthouse in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on a crisp autumn morning. The courtroom was packed, and most people believed the verdict was already decided. Our main character is Darius Jackson, a 19-year-old facing charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. But what no one in that courtroom knew was that Darius was not just another defendant. And now, let's dive into the story. Judge Thomas Wilson leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen lightly against the desk, his expression filled with impatience. "Let's get this case over with quickly," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Prosecutor Christopher Taylor smirked, treating the trial as nothing more than a routine formality. Darius Jackson sat still, showing no emotion. Taylor rose from his seat and stepped toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant was caught near the stolen vehicle. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and when approached by law enforcement, he ran. The evidence is clear." He paused, locking eyes with Darius, as if expecting a weak protest. But Darius simply smirked. Judge Wilson turned to Darius's defense attorney, an older woman whose worried expression betrayed her uncertainty. "Do you have anything to say in his defense?" he asked. Before she could respond, Darius stood up, his voice deep and unwavering. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." The courtroom fell silent. Wilson raised an eyebrow, while Taylor let out a mocking chuckle. They assumed he was just another reckless young man, unaware of what he was getting himself into. But Darius knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just a trial. This was his chance to turn the tables. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as Darius declared he would represent himself. Judge Thomas Wilson lowered his glasses, squinting at the young man standing before him. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. Darius nodded, stepping confidently into the center of the room. Prosecutor Christopher Taylor crossed his arms and shook his head with a smirk. "Your Honor, we're wasting time," he said. "The defendant may enjoy playing lawyer, but the facts remain the same. He was caught near the scene, his fingerprints were on the steering wheel, and the police saw him run. There's no need to drag this out." Darius tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Taylor," he said slowly, "you just stated that the police saw me driving the vehicle, correct?" Taylor shrugged. "That's right." Darius turned to Judge Wilson. "Your Honor, I request the GPS records of the police vehicle that reported the incident." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Taylor's smirk faded slightly, and a few members of the jury exchanged whispers. Judge Wilson tapped his fingers against the bench. "Reason?" he asked. Darius remained composed. "I believe the officer who claimed to have seen me was not actually present at the scene at the time he stated." A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Taylor's smug confidence wavered. This young man was not as simple as they had assumed. The courtroom fell into silence as Darius's request echoed through the air. Prosecutor Taylor blinked, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected move. Judge Wilson tapped his fingers lightly on the bench, weighing the situation. "The defendant's request is valid," he declared. "I order the presentation of the GPS data from the police vehicle in question." A court clerk hurried out of the room to retrieve the records. The tension in the courtroom grew heavier. Taylor tried to regain his composure, leaning on the prosecution table. "Regardless of what the GPS data shows," he said, "the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen car's steering wheel." Darius turned to the jury, his eyes sharp and calculated. "Let's consider a simple scenario," he said calmly. "You walk into a store, pick up an item, and put it back down. An hour later, that item is stolen. Does the presence of your fingerprints on it automatically make you the thief?" A few jury members exchanged glances. Darius continued, his words carefully measured. "Fingerprints only prove that I touched the car, not that I drove it." Taylor clenched his jaw, searching for a counter-argument. But before he could speak, the clerk returned with a stack of documents. Judge Wilson took the papers, flipping through them quickly before slowly looking up. His eyes darkened as he turned toward Taylor. "Mr. Taylor," Wilson said, his voice laced with implication, "would you like to explain this yourself?" No one in the courtroom dared to breathe. Darius simply smiled, knowing this was the turning point. Prosecutor Taylor snatched the stack of documents from Judge Wilson's hands, his eyes scanning the GPS data frantically. His face paled as he absorbed the undeniable truth. The police vehicle that the officer claimed had seen Darius was never at the scene at the time of the incident. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several jurors exchanged skeptical glances. Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "Mr. Taylor," he said slowly, "it appears the officer you relied on has falsified his report. Do you have an explanation for this?" Taylor swallowed hard, his confidence completely shattered. "Your Honor," he stammered, "there could be an error in the GPS data." Darius stepped forward, his voice calm, but his gaze sharper than ever. "An error?" he repeated. "Mr. Prosecutor, if you're trying to convince the court that the entire police department's GPS system is flawed while a single officer's statement is somehow infallible, then I'd argue that you are the one wasting the court's time." A few quiet chuckles arose from the gallery. Judge Wilson cleared his throat and tapped his gavel lightly. "I agree with the defendant," he declared. "The officer's testimony is no longer credible." Taylor made one last attempt to grasp at control. "But the fingerprints don't prove I drove the car," Darius cut in. "So tell me, Mr. Taylor, do you have any actual evidence left to convict me?" Taylor was speechless. The jury turned to him waiting. But for the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor had nothing left to say. The courtroom was so silent that the faint tapping of Judge Wilson's pen against the desk echoed through the air. Prosecutor Taylor stood frozen, his eyes glued to the case file as if hoping to find a missing piece of evidence. But there was nothing. No testimony from the officer. No solid proof that Darius had driven the stolen car. Darius turned toward the jury, his gaze sharp, but his voice remained steady. "When this trial began," he said, "the prosecutor confidently claimed that I was a thief. He told you that the police saw me driving the car, but now we all know that the officer who made that claim was never even at the scene." He took a slow step closer to the jury, making sure he held their full attention. "He said my fingerprints on the steering wheel were undeniable proof. But tell me, who among you has never touched something that didn't belong to you?" The jurors glanced at one another, doubt creeping into their expressions. A woman in the front row gave a small nod, as if something had finally clicked into place. Judge Wilson removed his glasses and looked at Taylor with clear disappointment. "Mr. Taylor, do you have any other evidence proving that the defendant was the one who drove this vehicle?" Taylor clenched the stack of papers in his hands. Every eye in the room was on him. He took a deep breath, then exhaled in resignation. "No, Your Honor." Once again, the courtroom fell silent. But this time, the silence carried an undeniable truth. Darius Jackson was innocent. Judge Wilson leaned back in his chair, set the case file down on his desk, and looked directly at Prosecutor Taylor. "If there is no further evidence, I see no reason to continue this trial," he said, his voice calm but firm. Taylor opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. He knew that any words at this moment would only further embarrass him. A case that had seemed straightforward, a trial he had expected to wrap up quickly, had now become a complete failure. He gave a small nod and lowered his gaze to the table. Darius remained still, his expression unreadable, but deep inside he knew he had won, not just for himself, but for so many others like him, those who had been falsely accused due to bias, the laziness of the justice system, and the faulty assumptions of those in power. Judge Wilson cleared his throat and raised his gavel. "Based on the evidence presented, I hereby dismiss all charges against the defendant, Darius Jackson. This trial is concluded." The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the courtroom like a bell ringing for justice. Some in the audience let out relieved sighs, while others shook their heads in quiet disapproval. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Darius had proven the truth. As he turned away from the defendant's table, his eyes met those of his mother, Simone Campbell, who had been watching every moment from the back row. She gave him a small nod, saying nothing, but Darius could see the pride in her eyes, and that was all he needed. Darius stepped out of the courtroom, feeling the crisp air outside, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere he had just left behind. He took a deep breath, as if shedding the heavy weight he had carried for so long. But this wasn't just his victory. This was proof that the truth, when defended properly, could still triumph over a flawed system. Simone Campbell approached her son, her eyes filled with pride, but also a hint of concern. "Do you realize what you just did?" she asked, her voice soft, but heavy with meaning. Darius nodded. "I didn't just defend myself. I proved that countless others have been wrongfully convicted simply because they had no voice." Simone let out a deep sigh, then suddenly smiled. "You have a sharp mind, Darius, but more importantly, you have courage." At that moment, a group of reporters rushed toward them, microphones and cameras raised. "Darius Jackson, do you have any comments about today's trial?" Darius glanced around, noticing the expectant faces watching him. Many had witnessed what had happened inside the courtroom. He knew he had a responsibility to speak. "This isn't just my victory," he said, his voice clear and strong. "This is a reminder that anyone can be falsely accused, but if we stand up, if we understand the law and fight for what's right, we can change everything." Simone squeezed her son's hand, her pride unmistakable. Darius's story might have ended here, but his journey had only just begun. The swarm of reporters continued throwing questions, but Darius didn't answer. He knew he had already said everything that needed to be said. Simone gave his hand a gentle squeeze, a silent reminder that he didn't have to carry everything on his shoulders right now. The two of them stepped down from the courthouse stairs, leaving behind the flashing cameras and the relentless questions. A light breeze swept through, carrying the cool touch of the late afternoon air. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, savoring his first true moment of freedom since he had been accused. But his mind was still racing. He had won this trial, but how many others out there never got the chance to defend themselves? Simone seemed to read his thoughts. "Darius," she said softly, "you know what you have to do next, don't you?" He opened his eyes and looked at his mother, and in that instant, everything became clear. He couldn't just walk away from this courthouse and pretend it was over. He had seen how the legal system worked, how justice could be twisted by those in power, and he knew he couldn't turn his back on that. "I'm going to study law," Darius said, his voice steady. "I'm going to become a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I'm going to fight for the people who don't have a voice." Simone smiled, a look of deep pride in her eyes. "I always knew you were meant for something greater." Darius gazed at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. Today, he had proven that justice could prevail, but tomorrow he would begin his journey to ensure that many others would have the chance to claim their own victories. The story of Darius Jackson is not just a personal legal battle, it is a profound lesson on justice, perseverance, and the power of knowledge. Darius didn't just defend himself, he proved that understanding the law can be the most powerful weapon against injustice. No one should be judged based on prejudice alone. The justice system is not perfect, and many innocent people have been wrongfully convicted simply because they lacked the opportunity or the knowledge to defend themselves. The most important thing is not just to criticize the system, but to learn how to use the law to change it. Know your rights, don't be afraid to ask questions, and always stand up when you see something wrong. Justice can only truly exist when we dare to challenge injustice and fight for what is right. If you or someone you know is being treated unfairly, don't stay silent. Take action, because change only happens when someone is brave enough to make it happen.